Leonor's crown tested by one forbidden pact. The morning light catches the stone before it reaches the crown. It always does. This is a place built to remind its occupants that institutions outlast individuals, and that duty arrives long before choice. In Spain, not every agreement is political. Some are forbidden because they test the crown itself. At first glance, the crown appears untouched by negotiation. It does not sign treaties. It does not pass laws. It does not campaign, bargain, or persuade. And yet, the crown is shaped by pacts more than any other institution in the state. Not the written ones, the silent ones. From the moment succession becomes inevitable, the heir enters a world governed less by permission than by prohibition. What may never be promised? What may never be implied? What may never be seen to exist, even if everyone knows it does? This is the living thread of continuity. The crown's power is not what it can do. It is what it must never appear to do. Spain's constitutional order rests on a careful separation. Elected authority governs, symbolic authority stabilizes. The crown anchors legitimacy precisely because it does not compete for it. That balance was not accidental. It was engineered in response to fracture, civil war, authoritarian rule, and a transition so fragile it could not afford ambiguity turning into rivalry. So an understanding emerged, never codified, never debated publicly, but rigorously enforced within the institution. The crown does not enter pacts that bind it to factions, movements, or outcomes that divide the nation. Even when such pacts would be legal. Even when they would be popular. Even when they would be personally convenient. By the second minute, the first cliffhanger settles in quietly. What happens when the future of the crown depends on a decision that is permitted by law, but CTUN? Because legality is not legitimacy here. And legitimacy is not negotiable. Succession is often imagined as inheritance. In reality, it is initiation. Preparation is not about learning protocol. It is about learning restraint so complete that it becomes instinctive. National identity is woven into these rituals. Uniforms, oaths, appearances, none of them are ornamental. They are rehearsals in limitation. The heir is taught, early and relentlessly, that the most dangerous agreements are the ones that seem harmless. An association, a public alignment, a symbolic endorsement that can never be fully retracted. At minute 5, the phrase must return, because this is where stakes sharpen. It is forbidden not because it violates the Constitution, but because it rewrites how the crown is perceived. Perception is the institution's currency. Once the crown is seen as choosing, it is judged as choosing. Once it is judged, it is debated. And once debated, it becomes optional. This is why the most consequential decisions surrounding succession are often the least visible. Why silence is preferred to clarification. Why delay is treated as wisdom rather than weakness. By minute 8, a deeper mystery emerges, one that is deliberately left unresolved. Every generation inherits a different Spain. More plural, more transparent, less patient with symbols that refuse explanation. The unspoken agreement between crown and country assumes a shared memory of why restraint matters. But memory fades. And when memory fades, rules must either be explained or abandoned. The institution resists both. At the midpoint, the escalation becomes unavoidable. The crown cannot modernize by negotiation. It cannot adapt through bargaining. Any pact that appears to trade neutrality for relevance threatens the very stability it is meant to guarantee. This is the approaching strain. How does an institution built on distance remain credible in an age that demands proximity? Foreign governments watch closely, not out of curiosity, but calculation. In the United States, credibility is measured by resilience under pressure. The question is whether Spain's symbolic anchor can endure generational change without polarization. In the United Kingdom, there is recognition, almost instinctive, of how quickly an ill-considered association can weaken a crown that survives on restraint. Canada and Australia observe how inherited symbolism holds when public consensus shifts faster than tradition. Germany views the situation through constitutional precision, alert to the risks of ambiguity hardening into uncertainty. None of these perspectives dictate Spain's choices. But all of them reflect how institutional stability is assessed beyond borders. By minute 14, the point of no return is not marked by crisis, but by awareness. There will come a moment when the crown is invited, politely, publicly, insistently, into an agreement it cannot accept without cost. Refusal will appear out of step. Acceptance will appear transformative. Both are dangerous, because the crown is not tested by rebellion. It is tested by offers. At minute 19, the future threat comes into focus. Not abolition, not confrontation, but normalization. A crown that enters pacts too freely does not fall. It dissolves. It becomes one institution among many, visible yet unprotected by distance. Present, but no longer singular. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. And presence must never feel conditional. As the final moments approach, the phrase returns one last time, carrying the weight of everything unsaid. The most consequential agreement is the one that must never be made. The one that promises relevance at the cost of inevitability. Spain stands, once again, at a familiar edge. Between adaptation and erosion, between explanation and restraint, the crown remains intact because it refuses certain doors, even when they appear open. Because it understands that some choices, once taken, cannot be untaken. The rituals continue, the silence holds, and history waits, not to see what the crown will do, but to see what it will continue to refuse. The refusal is never announced. It is simply observed, because in Spain, the crown does not justify what it withholds. It allows absence to speak. The second movement of this story is quieter, but more demanding. It is where preparation meets exposure. Where theory gives way to expectation. The institution understands something the public often forgets. A forbidden pact does not announce itself as dangerous. It arrives disguised as modernization, as relevance, as progress framed as inevitability. And that is precisely why it is forbidden. The crown is expected to modernize without aligning, to evolve without endorsing, to be present without belonging. This is not contradiction, it is design. Continuity here is maintained not by action, but by calibration. How often the crown appears, where it appears, what it never comments on, who it is never seen beside when the stakes are symbolic rather than procedural. These choices are not personal, they are structural. This is the living thread of continuity. As visibility increases, margin for error collapses. Every gesture becomes archival, every silence becomes interpretable, every appearance is measured against what it might authorize tomorrow. The forbidden pact is not always formal. More often, it is atmospheric. An expectation that the crown will signal approval, that it will reassure one side of a national debate, that it will lend emotional weight to a question the state itself cannot settle cleanly. This is where restraint becomes the only form of power left. At this stage, the institution's greatest challenge is not opposition. It is invitation. Invitations cannot be prosecuted. They cannot be appealed. They can only be declined. And decline, repeated often enough, carries its own cost. The world beyond Spain reads these moments closely. In the United States, the question is whether symbolic institutions can still stabilize plural societies without becoming participants in cultural competition. In the United Kingdom, there is a familiar unease, an understanding that once a crown appears to take a position, it must spend generations climbing back to neutrality. Canada and Australia assess whether inherited legitimacy can survive if it begins to resemble advocacy rather than continuity. Germany observes the balance with disciplined skepticism, aware that legitimacy unanchored from clarity must be managed with exceptional care. None of these perspectives are advisory. They are diagnostic, because institutional credibility is global now. And erosion, once visible, travels. The forbidden pact becomes most tempting at precisely this moment, when silence begins to look like avoidance, and restraint is misread as indecision. This is the most dangerous phase. The crown is expected to reassure without committing, to represent unity without defining it, to remain untouched by agreements that would bind it emotionally, symbolically, or generationally. Duty outweighs desire here, always has. At the heart of the system is an understanding so stark it is never voiced aloud. A crown that accepts the wrong pact may continue to exist, but it will no longer anchor the state. It will float. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. And presence must never feel transactional. This is why the institution prizes boredom, predictability, repetition. They are not failures of imagination. They are defenses. The closer the crown comes to relevance defined by the moment, the further it moves from inevitability defined by time. The forbidden pact is resisted not once, but continually. Every year, every cycle, every generation, and that resistance is the work. Nothing dramatic happens. No rupture, no declaration, only the steady refusal to trade permanence for immediacy. The system holds, for now, and the tension remains unresolved. Exactly where institutions reveal whether they are built to endure, or merely to be admired. Time is the final pressure. Not urgency, not scandal. Time, because the crown does not confront its trials all at once. They arrive incrementally, disguised as normality, as invitations that feel reasonable, as expectations that sound civic rather than constitutional. The third movement is where endurance is tested. Here, the institution must demonstrate something more difficult than refusal. It must demonstrate consistency. A single rejection can be framed as principle. A pattern of rejection is framed as posture. And posture, once noticed, invites challenge. This is the risk Spain understands better than most. The more disciplined the silence, the more tempting it becomes to force it to speak. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. And presence, repeated often enough, becomes interpreted. Every public role carries weight beyond its wording. Every ceremonial act is read as precedent. Every absence is interrogated for meaning. The Forbidden Pact presses hardest not when stakes are obvious, but when they are subtle. When alignment looks harmless. When association feels benign. When restraint begins to resemble detachment. This is when the institution leans most heavily on ritual. Ritual slows time. It absorbs pressure. It reminds the public that permanence does not respond to provocation. National identity is woven into these rituals. Not as nostalgia, but as continuity rehearsed in public view. The crown returns again and again to the same gestures. The same language. The same carefully neutral spaces. Not to avoid relevance, but to redefine it. Relevance here is not being heard. It is being relied upon. Foreign observers recognize this shift when it happens. In Washington, endurance signals reliability. In London, repetition signals legitimacy. In Ottawa and Canberra, distance signals neutrality. In Berlin, restraint signals institutional maturity. None of these interpretations are declared. They are inferred. Because credibility at this level is never announced. It is accumulated. And yet, accumulation carries risk. The longer the crown refuses forbidden pacts, the more those pacts are framed as overdue. The more refusal is interpreted as resistance to change rather than protection of continuity. This is where misunderstanding becomes dangerous. The institution cannot clarify without compromising itself. It cannot defend without defining. And defining the forbidden pact would make it negotiable. So the silence persists, not passive, active, maintained through discipline, repetition, and the deliberate narrowing of acceptable action. This is not indecision, it is containment. The crown accepts constraints so that the state does not fracture under competing claims of legitimacy. This is the quiet trade Spain continues to make. Personal expression for institutional survival. Immediate clarity for long-term stability. The pressure does not break the system. It sharpens it. And still, the future remains unresolved. Because no institution can rely forever on understanding that is never spoken. At some point, restraint must either be trusted, or tested. The crown stands ready for neither applause nor confrontation. Only for continuity. And the forbidden pact remains exactly where it has always been. Just within reach. Never accepted. Never forgotten. Waiting to see whether time will protect the silence. Or demand that it finally be broken. What endures is not certainty. It is restraint maintained long enough to become trust. Spain's crown has never survived by winning arguments. It has survived by refusing them. By understanding that the most dangerous agreements are not those imposed by force, but those accepted willingly in the name of relevance. The Forbidden Pact was never about legality. It was about identity. About whether the crown remains a stabilizing constant, or becomes another participant in the currents it was designed to steady. This is why the final test is never dramatic. There is no single moment of decision. Only accumulation. Small expectations. Repeated invitations. Quiet pressures to clarify, align, modernize, explain. Each one asks the same question in a different voice. Will the crown trade distance for immediacy? So far, it has not. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. And presence that endures must never feel contingent on agreement. The future does not hinge on one refusal. It hinges on whether refusal remains possible. When silence is misread, when patience is questioned, when restraint is no longer fashionable. History does not announce when institutions cross the threshold from permanence to fragility. It records it later, once the damage has already been done. For now, the rituals continue. The absences remain deliberate. The Forbidden Pact stays unsigned, not because it is unknown, but because it is understood. And Spain moves forward as it always has when its institutions are most exposed. Quietly, carefully, aware that what preserves the crown is not what it dares to accept, but what it continues, resolutely, to refuse. The story does not conclude. It holds, at the precise point where continuity is still intact, and the next choice has not yet been demanded.